Uh, Live. All right. Hi, everybody. Hopefully many of you can join us this afternoon. I'm Naomi, and you see Kathy here. We're very happy to see you guys or be with you guys this afternoon, and are really pleased with all the conversations that we've seen so far in the course. It's really been great, and we're looking forward to another great 3 weeks. That said, so if you guys are watching, since the webcast, as you see, is on its own sort of page, if you're watching, just and on Twitter, tweet with the hashtag SmithsonianXED. And so if you have conversations you want to have, you can use that hashtag, but also just tweet and let us know that you're out there. And if you're on Facebook, then you can post to C3 teachers, and Carly's there and moderating that discussion, and then we'll also get a chance to see that you're there as well. Or if you have questions as we go through, in addition to those two places, you can also find us by email at smithsonianx@si.edu. So hopefully you'll use one of those to let us know that you're watching, and let us know if you have any questions as we go through. I also want to say thank you guys all so much for your patience and for letting us know about the various bugs that you've come across. We fixed this week's, I think. So take a look back and see if you can post now. As for last week's, we've been talking with edX. It looks like we can't correct scores, but know that this is a pass-fail course, so really, as long as you participate in the activities, you really should pass the course. So I'll email that to you guys as well, but don't worry about your scores. And I checked, a lot of you guys are, I mean, it was all passing scores anyway, but just know that you'll be fine for that. And thank you guys again for your patience. And as you know, we're learning as you guys learn too about the platform. So again, we appreciate you letting us know if there's something that needs fixing. So with that said, we'll get started. We were really excited with all the questions that you guys posed for us for this webinar or webcast, which will be about half an hour long. So we'll start with your questions that you posted before, and if you have some as we go, that's great too. So the first one comes from Bobby and also Deborah M., who both asked sort of the same question, which is sort of, how do I get started with compelling questions? What are more examples of those? So Kathy, would you mind talking a little bit about how you get started?
Sure. Well, there's no bank of compelling questions that I know that are out there, like primary sources that you can search on a web. But what I will say is that there's a current project that I'm working on in New York for all you New York teachers out there, and it will be publicly available next year, called the New York Social Studies Toolkit Project. And in that project, we're developing 84 inquiries. 84 by next June, and each of them will be anchored in a compelling question. So that will be a pretty big project that will hopefully exemplify what we're thinking about in terms of compelling questions. But the other thing that I would say about that is, I think for the most part, the teachers that I meet know how to create academic questions. That's not the problem. The problem tends to be in making them kid-friendly and having kids be curious about those questions. So I've been really enamored with a project called the Right Question Institute up in Boston. They're associated with Harvard, and they have a technique called the question formulation technique, the QFT, in which they have students generating questions. Students go through a process of, you begin by giving them what's called a question focus. So I can see definitely a lot of the objects that you all worked with last week being a question focus, using a photograph, using an object, using a newspaper article, a phrase. And students start by just generating questions. They don't judge, they don't prioritize, they just generate questions. And then after you give them time to do that, the second part is improving the question. So working, first they code the questions as either closed or open. I have students do compelling or supporting as the coding mechanism. And then you have them choose a couple to work with to make them more like poetry. And then third, they prioritize those questions and then reflect. And so what I would say when I've been doing this with participants, it's yielding all sorts of genuine compelling questions. I mean, mean, compelling is in the eye of the beholder, right? That's a notion that who is it compelling to? And that the idea that students are generating questions and they're prioritizing them and they're saying, look, these are my 3 favorite questions, to me, that is a very definition of compelling. And so one of the things that I would suggest as you start a unit or a module or some kind of curricular sequence is take a topic, the Aztecs, the American Revolution, Civil War, civil rights, and begin with an object like the Greensboro counter that they have at the Smithsonian, a Conestoga wagon, and see what kinds of questions students ask, and then as a teacher, use your samurai skills to be able to frame the unit with that. So that would be my suggestion. And the other thing that I'd end with is don't be afraid. I think that play around with compelling questions. I think this is a new idea. We knew that it was frontier territory when we put it in the C3, that we didn't have a lot to go on from other standards documents or other documents in general, other than perhaps understanding by design that really kind of had a corner on the market around essential questions. So I think that's a good place to start. I think where essential questions maybe leave off a bit is the kid-friendly piece. And so I would think about how do you take those essential questions and make them more compelling to kids. So that would be my advice.
Oh, that's great. And I think just to follow up on that, Kathy actually did a really wonderful workshop with some of the educators and curators here at the museum this morning about building compelling questions using the framework that she talked about. And it really worked well to get people to generate questions and then kind of hone and refine them and think about them more deeply. And so we'll share, I think, a link to the resources or talk more about it in the course info. So we'll give you more information about that. All right. So following up on that, Jordan and Mandy asked about sort of taking it deeper. So Jordan says, after I present a compelling question, my kids are engaged, but how do I take them to the next level, inquiring into deeper understanding or research project or deep discussion? Mandy says, how do I get my kids to think deeper about the question? They have trouble with critical thinking and often give up rather than work harder. So what do you say about that?
Well, I think that's natural for kids. You ask this profound, compelling question, and they're all in, But then what do they do next? Because sometimes these questions can be so big that they're almost overwhelming to kids. And so I think supporting questions, the role of supporting questions is really to help propel the inquiry forward to do exactly kind of the issue that you brought out here, both Jordan and Mandy, which is what are the kind of formative steps that kids need to explore in order to get back to that compelling question. And it doesn't mean that they have to leave the compelling question at the end, but I really see the role of these supporting questions as scaffolds to moving students towards an answer or an argument of the compelling question. So I almost see them as stepping stones and as a way that kids can make sense and maybe chip away at the kind of the dimension of the question. So that's what I would answer that with.
Okay, great.
So Jordan also asked, Jordan was very busy asking questions about questions. And so one of the things he asked was, once I present a compelling question to the class and get them engaged, where would I find the right resources that will tell history the way it happened? Naomi, do you want to take this one?
Sure, yeah. So I thought that this is a really interesting question. And I think because really the way it happened, there are lots of ways to think about that. There are multiple perspectives, people who lived through the time who would see how it happened very differently, right? So all history is an interpretation, right? So all the secondary sources that you'll find will be, how this person or set of people interpreted the sources that were there. So I'd say, for one thing, you might have your kids wrestle with a couple of different interpretations at the secondary level and see how they compare. You might also just give them access. The issue with this is that this takes time to do, but I think it's really worthwhile, to find some really compelling sources from different sides of an event and have kids develop their own interpretation. We'll talk more about that as the weeks go on, as we talk about evaluating evidence and the tools of the historian. But there's no, you're not going to find a single source that tells history the way it happened, because there are lots of ways to think about lots of ways to interpret how the past took place. So I'd say give your kids the opportunity to wrestle with that issue and to do the work of interpretation and the work that historians do themselves.
Great.
Fair. So that said, G. Bailey asked about compelling questions adjusted for grade levels. So how does a question for a student in 3rd grade compare to 9th grade? What about 2nd and 12th? How does adjusting a question for grade level impact the compellingness of the question? I think it's a really interesting question.
Yeah, it's a great question about questions. I guess I would say 2 things that are going to end up sounding a little messy. But the one is that I kind of believe in this notion that what is really great for adults can be just as great for kids. So take a question like, what color am I? Adults wrestle with that question, but it's written in such a way that obviously is accessible to 2nd and 3rd graders. Why do we have rules? That's another good one. We wrestle with that, right? Why are there rules around banking? Should we have rules around our economy? Should we have rules in general? I mean, kids deal with that at a very personal level. So what I would say is that any question that we ask can probably be scaled down. I think any curriculum really could be scaled down to an elementary level to get at the very kernel of the big idea that's inherent in that question. I do think that the language shifts a little bit from obviously a 12th grader down to a 2nd grader sometimes. So I think that we have to keep the audience in mind. So a question like, was the American Revolution really that revolutionary? Might be great for a middle school or high schooler. I'm not sure how compelling that is to a 1st and 2nd grader, just because of where they are, their extent at which they understand history and sort of how big that question is, really, in thinking about revolutionary movements. So I think my big caution would be that I often see elementary getting cutesy. And so I would avoid getting too cute with elementary students. I have an elementary student myself, a son, and I've worked with elementary students a bit, in my career as an educator, and they can deal with hard issues like, what color am I? Why do we have rules? What's the deal with hair? They can ask big idea questions without getting too silly, I guess, is what I would say. But I definitely see the need for teachers certainly to play with language across the K-12 spectrum. So, okay, so Mrs. K says, I love the idea of creating compelling questions that will ask our students to be thinkers and analyzers. However, I worry sometimes that compelling questions are controversial or raise controversy. How do you manage that, especially in today's world of rapid news? Naomi?
Yeah, so this is another of many great questions. And I think it's one that hopefully I can try to answer from the museum's perspective, because as a public institution, we want to ask compelling questions, and we have a really diverse audience. We have visitors from all across the country and the world who come with really different experiences and backgrounds. So we have to be very careful about how we ask questions. And I say that when we build questions that are the basis of programs or that are in exhibitions, we try to be open-ended. We try to offer big questions that you could answer in a lot of different ways, and not just as a yes or no, or sort of setting up a binary, but really thinking about what are sort of the broad range of ways that you might consider this question. And thinking of and trying to get people to think about a middle ground or a third perspective or something like that, if that makes sense. So, the one that you'll see very often that I think is a really good example of what we do here at the museum is the question about the legacy of John Brown. How should we remember John Brown? And sometimes we do set up that, is he a hero, a villain? But what we're really trying to do is say that it's really complex, and there are a lot of ways to think about this. So I think people can come away with saying that, they find some third or fourth way of thinking about him, and that's what we're going for. So, and I think again, in thinking about open-ended questions, I was realizing that we were just doing this yesterday. I was sitting around with some fellow educators thinking about a new exhibition on immigration and migration. There are a lot of complicated, complex questions around immigration and migration, and so we were trying to develop questions that could be friendly to the audience, but that also would really get you to just maybe shift your perspective a little bit. And again, not necessarily saying yes or no, or this side or that side, but just thinking differently. Like, should or how does education make us American? How do we decide who's one of us? How did the World War shape us? Those are some of, and Kathy, you can weigh in on how compelling or how much those fit the criteria. But I think that's, we're going for those sort of larger questions that are not setting up the binary. I also think, as Kathy said, these are supposed to be kid friendly, and so encouraging kids to develop them themselves and kind of talking through their various ideas about questions, I think might also help you if you can talk them through, well, how did you develop this question as opposed to this question, and what's behind it might help kind of get at some of those thornier issues rather than you throwing out a question that then might be considered controversial or something. I don't know. Kathy, do you have any other input that you want to put on that?
Yeah, I mean, I can say that when we wrote the C3, we wanted more controversy in the classroom. I mean, we feel like in social studies, we should own controversial issues. I mean, really, it's the place where we learn to deliberatively discourse about tough issues, and we teach kids how to navigate those conversations. And so I would say, first of all, that I really think that that while it's tricky ground, that it's ground that we should definitely walk on because it's who we are as social studies educators. With that said, also, in my day job, I work with pre-service teachers, and as a methods instructor, I try to work with teachers a lot on this very issue. How much controversy is too much controversy? And I certainly steer my first-year teachers away from day one. For instance, doing some major controversy that hasn't tipped. I think that you have to think about your context. You have to think about your audience, your parents that you're, of the kids that you're working with. I think you need to think about talking with your administration if you're a newer teacher. Veteran teachers may not need that kind of cover, I guess. And the other thing is, I think that you have to think about the age of the kids that you're dealing with. And so this past week, my colleagues S.G. Grant and John Lee and we were working on an inquiry on children's human rights for third grade, part of the New York project that I was talking about. And what's interesting about this inquiry is that it focuses on the United Nations Treaty around children's human rights. And the United States and Somalia were the only countries to not ratify this treaty. And so we, John and I both picked up on this and said, should we make this a feature of the inquiry? And so the three of us are really debating, can third graders, is it realistic for a teacher to try and navigate that kind of international politics with the third grader? Or should we really just stick to, having the students explore the tragedy of child labor and girls' education around the globe? I say that because, even we're working through those issues, thinking about the context, thinking about the age, not wanting to run from something that's really interesting, I think, for kids to deal with. But I think, quite honestly, we're erring on the side of mentioning it to the teacher, providing some resources to the teacher, but saying, third grade's a little young, to have to navigate our international kind of policies, political policies. So anyway, that's what I'd add.
Yeah, and I do want to support. And I hope I didn't suggest that we shy away from controversy, but I think, as a museum, we want to find ways to talk about controversial issues in a way that's comfortable. So we do that in a number of ways by finding, framing the questions well, but also using things like historical theater and characters and things like that. So hopefully that will help you a bit in thinking about controversial questions. And I mean, controversy exists in this world, right? So we're training young people to become active participants in the wider world. So as Kathy says, how we model that for them in these years will affect them over their lifetime. So.
Can I just add one thing? I forgot to mention one of my favorite resources is a book by Diana Hess, and it's called Controversy in the Classroom. And it's one of two books. I require a lot of reading in my class, but it's one of two books that I have my students read every semester. And it really walks through different case studies of teachers and methods for dealing with controversy. And the chapter that my students always turn to is to disclose or not to disclose. How do you deal with kind of your own political feelings about these issues, controversial issues, and do you tell your students or do you reveal that? And so I'll leave that as a cliffhanger for you, but it's definitely my favorite go-to book on the issue.
Could you just say the title again, just in case?
Yeah, it's called Controversy in the Classroom by Diana Hess.
Great, perfect. I'm going to go out and get it myself, actually.
Yeah.
All right, so next question is from some anonymous poster, but the question is, how much background knowledge of the time period would you suggest a teacher needs to have to use compelling questions? What do you think, Kathy?
Well, I think that, so I'll keep mentioning this New York project. I'm learning lots of lessons in addition to my 20 years, as an educator. And what I would say is that, that in order to really come up with a great question, you do need to spend time reading about the subject. So like every time we've been approaching an inquiry, and you could imagine 84 inquiries, we have to work pretty quickly. I'm establishing a reading period. It's almost like writing a term paper where the impulse is to start writing and not to spend the time kind of outlining and thinking. And what I would say is that you want to spend at least a night, if not more, really trying to find out what's interesting about a topic. So, for instance, I've been working on this inquiry on the Aztecs. Now, I know a little bit about the Aztecs, but I'm not really up on kind of the current historical discourse, the archaeological pieces. And so I had to spend a good couple of weeks just reading and Googling and trying to find out, using the New York Times, trying to figure out kind of an angle or a lens to get a question really rich. And so I think, it's hard, and I work with a lot of novice teachers. It's hard to develop a thick content knowledge and pedagogical knowledge at the same time. So I would say, but what I would say to you is that I think your inclination is right. That it does good questions come from a thick understanding of a topic. But on the other hand, I don't want to let that scare you either. I mean, we're all works in progress as teachers. It's a journey, and so I know in my own practice, I have to spend the time thinking about what's interesting about a topic, and obviously after 20 years, I might have more experience with some topics than others. But ultimately, the kernel of it is, and I say this to my student teachers all the time, if you're curious, if it's clear to your students that you're curious, then they will be curious, that curiosity is infectious. And so I wouldn't wait on having the greatest question that ever was written, I would definitely, I would think about just really sharing your own curiosity, showing gaps in your own understanding, and working with the students on developing really curious questions. I think that's the place to start.
Great. I mean, my default answer for all these things is always use museums, but that's what I'm going to say. I think, we're online exhibitions. We'll talk about that in week 6 too, but I'll just say it now. Exhibitions are written for a general audience, and they're designed to get a lot of content into a very small amount of space. Exhibition labels are usually about 100 words at most per label. So, online exhibitions can be great places for you to build that content knowledge, at least the beginning of it, too. I'd encourage you to go there. As a teacher, they can be just really nice little snapshots for you about kind of the big issues, the big questions, the major historical interpretations that are there. So that can be helpful for you too. But I also, with like Kathy, I think a lot of this and what we're, the message we're hoping to share is that it's about learning together. It's about modeling processes of inquiry across your lessons. So have research together with your kids. Have your kids find out, just build your questions, and then together you can look for some answers. Even if you don't build the well. Kathy, stop me if I'm saying anything that you disagree with. But I think if you have a question about a time period, even if you haven't formed that main compelling question because you don't have all the content, finding those supporting questions first is sometimes okay, right? That you guys can start to just research and learn more about the time period or the topic or the people, and then think about, well, what else do we want to know about this? Now that we've learned this, what else do we need to know? And maybe that's the compelling question that comes out of that research. So, do you agree?
Absolutely. I've been sitting here thinking well, where do I find most of my compelling questions? And I don't think it has to be being a, museum curator who knows everything and anything about a topic. There's a happy medium, but often I'll stumble on an article or an object label or something that I just go, that's an interesting angle or lens to start pulling threads. I may not know the answer to the question, but I just look for, I guess, a bit of inspiration for the question. So speaking of this, Naomi, you're going to love our last question. So our last question comes from Bobby, who asks, from some of the discussions I've read, it seems several people would like to learn more about resources available for providing in-class museum experiences. Wow, I don't know who would be better to answer that question, but you, Naomi.
Well, I'm really happy to hear that question, and I did post some responses in the discussion about this too. But I think I'll say more here, which is that I really encourage you for in-class experiences, places like the Smithsonian. Sometimes it can be more challenging. There are national museums or Smithsonian museums like the African American History and Culture Museum that do in-class programs, but I'd say really look to your local resources. So find out if you have a state museum or a state historical society. Those sorts of organizations often have traveling trunks, so collections of objects that you can rent, we used to call them, when I worked at the Maryland Historical Society, in-class field trips. So someone will come to your class, or there are tons of virtual field trips out there. The Minnesota Historical Society is the one that comes to mind first, but look to Skype in the classroom, and I know the Buffalo Bill Center of the West does a lot of those, and there are tons more out there that can bring characters or educators to your classroom. The National World War II Museum in New Orleans also does a lot of online interactions, as well as having traveling programs in their general area. So I'd say look to those local museums, but also Google is your friend. Google traveling trunk colonial era, see what you find, or in-class field trip or virtual field trip, or Skype with expert on this topic. That said, I think sometimes somebody was asking about living history characters too, and that can be a question because there are lots of independent people, and how do you choose, and how do you know what the quality is going to be, that sort of thing. I would say look to your state humanities council. A lot of those run Chautauqua programs, so those are living history programs that you can, in Maryland where I worked, you could have Frederick Douglass come to your class, or Harriet Tubman or something. So the Chautauqua programs and the Humanities Councils are also really good places to go. But as I said, for in-class resources, really look to those local museums. And I hope that helps. And I hope you guys find great resources. Oh, and I should mention too, the National Park Service also has a really great traveling trunk program, especially their site around St. Louis has a number of resources around westward expansion that I think would be useful for many classrooms. So you can look for them as well. Oh, and I should, well, before we wrap up, I just want to say too that there was a conversation about personal objects, and I was really excited to see that. Kids bringing in their own objects, introduce themselves at the beginning of the year or something like that. And I'll just mention that we have a resource on our website called Object Portraits, where kids look at the work of an artist named Robert Weingarten, who has taken sort of collages of objects and places that are meaningful to famous Americans and turned them into these portraits made out of these objects. And so using that as an inspiration, the kids can then create their own object portraits of like 5 or 6 things that are meaningful to them. And there's some suggestions about how you can build out from that into a larger class project. So I encourage you to look for that on History Explorer as well, and we'll post that up in the course info too. So thanks for the question about looking for resources, and I was really excited to see all the resources people are already using. That's really great. So is there anything else on your end, Kathy? I think I have one more. I pulled one more question out.
Okay.
Yeah, that was about, and this is maybe something that you can weigh in on too, but Jay Humphreys asked about that she's taken kids to a museum before to learn about how exhibitions are made, to observe that, and then come back and make their own museums. But it's really a lot of work to and just bureaucracy to try to have a field trip. So how do you create those kinds of unique learning experiences without leaving the classroom? And so I'll just say that there are some really wonderful and kind of immersive online exhibitions that can be valuable. One that I'm thinking of here is called Beyond Bollywood, that is sort of a really dynamic site that looks at a number of images around being Indian American. And so those sorts of online exhibitions can be useful. And it is still important in an online exhibition to think about what's the, if not the physical experience, what's the user experience, right? Like what comes first and next and after that? What's the story you're telling? How do you move through the site? What are the representative objects or images that are helping you tell the story? I think you can do a lot of that work by looking at some of those sites. And I'll post that in the course info as well. But do you have other thoughts about, not necessarily museum exhibition, but like, creating some unique experience in the classroom, Kathy?
Yeah, well, I mean, Naomi and I wrote a lesson this year, didn't we? How do you make a flag stand? That will be coming out next month in a book called Teaching the C3 Framework. But in that chapter, we talked about having students create, a museum almost like you were describing. And so I've taken that idea and I've been working with the Aztec inquiry a bit, where students would choose, each student in the class would select 2 different artifacts from their study, and then as a class, they would decide which one of those artifacts would make it in the museum, meaning that they'd have to choose between the 2, so that there's some kind of judiciousness that's happening, just like they do in museums, where you can't put everything. I had the opportunity to see behind the scenes at the American History Museum, and it's amazing. But to see, like, once you get behind the walls, the archives, the literal archives of physical objects is just, it's really breathtaking. They took me to one exhibit or archive of all of the Kentucky oil lamps. And I think there was like 100 and something, 200 oil lamps from Kentucky, from the coal mines in Kentucky. And so, at a certain point, a curator is going to have to make decisions about which oil lamp, if an oil lamp is going to go into an exhibit on coal. And so I think that's a really interesting thing for kids to maybe decide, is what goes down in history or what goes down in an exhibit. And then in this inquiry that I'm currently writing, students are doing those object labels. So they're using examples from the Smithsonian American History Museum and seeing that this paragraph, this densely written paragraph, does really important things. So at the end, they're creating a museum of, say, 20-something objects with their object cards, and so it kind of gives a bit of a feel of a museum in the classroom.
Yeah, great. And do stay tuned for week 6, because we'll talk more about this, and we'll take you on a tour of an exhibition and how you might use that. And you could actually just use that video with your students, really, if you wanted, or tell us how you think we can modify it, and how it might work with your students. So I think we've come to the end of our questions. I hope this has been useful. We've been recording it, so we're going to post this in the course as well. You can always go back to it. And thanks so much for all these really wonderful questions and your participation. So far, like we said, we're really looking forward to the next 3 weeks. So, and thanks, Kathy. Nice talking to you. See you later.